Hello, can you hear me? Pat, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Sean. We do hear you. Thanks for joining us.
I see. Thank you.
Ron, we're glad you made it.
Thank you very much, Dave. Nice to see you.
Okay, well, let's get started. Hello, everyone. The Water Reuse Association is pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Stormwater Capture, Drivers, Impediments, and Future Visions. My name is Pat Sinacropi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Water Reuse Association. And I'd like to thank you for your participation on today's webinar. Today's webcast is brought to you in partnership with the Water Reuse Association, the US EPA, the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, the Water Environment Federation, and the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread. And hopefully at some point we'll be at Wingspread all together once we're able to travel again. The webcast is the first in a series of national conversations about stormwater capture and reuse as part of the National Water Reuse Action Plan, or more commonly referred to as the RAP. Many of you are hopefully familiar with the RAP and may have even participated in developing its over 40 action items geared toward facilitating greater adoption of water reuse approaches to managing our water resources issues. If you're not familiar with the RAP, I encourage you to visit our website, waterreuse.org, or EPA's website, epa.gov, to learn how you can engage in the various policy discussions and other action items moving forward under the RAP effort. It truly is a very broad effort involving a lot of partners and organizations. We're doing great work under it, and I would encourage everyone who is participating on today's webcast to check it out and get involved. Today's topic, stormwater capture and reuse, discusses an approach to water reuse that is quickly becoming an important topic for communities struggling with scarcity of supply issues, as well as communities dealing with water quality challenges and TMDL restrictions in local receiving waters. We hope this webinar is both informative and a beginning of a longer-term effort to help the water sector develop a deeper understanding of how stormwater capture can effectively help address many water-related challenges. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our facilitator for today, Molly Mayo. She's with Meridian Institute, and I've worked extensively with her. It's great to see you, Molly, and thank you for helping facilitate today's webcast. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Pat. And thanks to the whole water reuse team for helping to set us up, host this webinar, and for all the great work that you've been doing on this issue leading up to, and also a lot of work that will be supporting this discussion following up on today's webinar. I'm going to cover a little bit of quick business for everyone before going into a summary of our plan for today's webinar. First, everyone will note that we are recording, and we are planning to make the recording available to those who have registered afterwards and share it more broadly. Our goal is to be able to help to inform broader communities, and we'll use this as an opportunity to do that. We also will be making the chat function available to participants and observers with the intent of allowing all of you on the webinar to be able to both offer some resources that we could make available to others subsequently, and or to offer questions or comments that we could then pull into the conversation with the panelists. We also are going to be taking notes and providing some highlights from this conversation that will be used for further materials and discussions in the future, and are excited to be able to take this conversation forward into additional discussion topics on stormwater capture and use in the future. So for today, The plan is to go through a series of 3 panels. Each one is intended to offer a range of perspectives and allow for some interaction among colleagues that have been actively working to advance stormwater capture and use in their regions. The first panel will focus on water abundant areas of the country and the voices that represent some of the perspectives coming from that vantage point. The second one will focus on water scarce regions of the country. And the third will bring them together with a focus in particular on the value of diverse perspectives and diverse needs and interests and how important that is as we design for a future where stormwater capture and use is one of the many effective tools in the toolbox. Obviously with a message that we are not trying to design for a single type of situation, but there are many that we're trying to understand as we advance our tools in this area. We're excited to be joined by some terrific representatives and experts from around the country, and we'll do our best to get some really helpful information that will hopefully be valuable to others around the country in the future. So with that, let me turn to Dave Smith, who will provide some insights on the rest of the panel, the rest of the participants in the webinar, and some insights on this issue overall. And a big thanks to Dave, EPA Region 9, and other supporting cast who have helped to make this webinar happen. Thanks, Dave, for all of your help.
Well, thank you, Molly. And I'd like to add my welcome to everyone. We're really happy so many people could join us. I'd like to add my thanks to our host Water Reuse Association, our co-sponsoring organizations, our esteemed panelists, and most of all to our many, many viewers. I'm glad you could make it today. I'm going to spend just a moment talking a little bit about why we're here today and how that fits into our broader set of things that we're trying to do. And talk a little bit about what we heard back from you when you registered. As Pat mentioned, the National Water Reuse Action Plan does provide a framework for national collaboration and action to support water reuse and integrated water planning throughout the nation. And working with a host of partner organizations, we're making good progress on a series of actions to really help build our nation's capacity to recycle water better. The action we're talking about today, action number 2.3.3, is focusing on stormwater capture and use. We're working to raise awareness about how stormwater capture drivers and impediments vary across the country and help set priorities to build our ability to pursue stormwater harvesting around the country in the future. And we hope that these efforts through these webcasts that we're going to do help us identify priorities for future work to build your capacity to pursue this kind of thing. There's a diversity of interests and experience with reuse in general and with stormwater management in particular, and we're going to probe that more today. The webcast is the first in a series to explore these kinds of options and needs to build capacity. It's going to lead up to a national convening later this year in partnership with the Johnson Foundation and future decisions about investments to help build tools and other methods to build your capacity to pursue reuse in the future. Before we turn to our panelists, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we heard from you. May I have the next slide, please? And the next one. We had more than 460 people respond to the questions, and we greatly appreciate that. I'm just going to echo back a little bit about what you told us. You're from all over the country, a little bit more than a third from the West, but healthy turnouts of folks from the Southwest, the South, and from the East. Maybe a few fewer people from the Midwest, but that'll give us a place to work on. Next slide, please. Are you from a water-rich or a water-poor area? Yes, it's about 60-40, with most of you coming from areas that are more water-poor and relatively fewer of you from water-rich areas. But I think this is significant because it shows that interest in stormwater capture is not just from the driest areas of the country. Next slide, please. and you're interested in stormwater capture and use. More than 40% are either highly interested or at least moderately interested. I'm happiest, though, that the folks who reported that there's little or no interest in stormwater capture in your areas are participating today, and we can increase that interest a little bit as a result of this work. Next slide, please. What were the drivers that you mentioned as being of concern or of interest concerning stormwater capture and use? The most important point is that most of you cited multiple drivers, multiple motivations for getting interested in and pursuing stormwater capture and use. Water quality related drivers were number one on this list with more than 60% mentioning this. Also, a very large number were mentioning flood control related interests and drivers as being important. But we also had very high percentage mentions of things like water supply resiliency, regulatory concerns. Yes, augmenting water supply was of interest to just less than 40% of you. Also a great deal of interest in supporting urban quality of life and seeing how stormwater capture can fit into that. Interest also in aquifer protection. And so I think that for me, this just illustrates that there's a lot of reasons why people are interested in pursuing stormwater capture and use. Next slide, please. And lastly, we asked you to talk about what's getting in the way of progress. Not surprisingly, funding came up as number one, or perhaps lack thereof. This is not surprising to me, at least. This shows up as number one in most discussions about pursuing anything new in the water sector. But I thought the other barriers you mentioned were interesting. Difficulty in building public support and understanding, and the same with decision makers, was the second most highly mentioned barrier. Regulatory concerns were on a lot of people's minds, as were organizational issues that make it difficult to collaborate in pursuing these kinds of projects. Just under 40% of people just mentioned that you don't really have time to pursue these kinds of things, and we understand that. Hard to make time to do new things. One thing I thought very interesting, though, was that technology barriers were not cited by very many of you as being a key concern. And so that's something that will maybe influence our thinking about where we most need to invest in future development in the future. So that's a little bit about what we heard from this large and diverse group. And I hope that you really enjoy hearing the perspectives of this great group of panelists who are joining us. So thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Molly.
Thanks, Dave. All right, great. Now we get to move on to some of our featured guest panelists. The first one, as I mentioned, is a focus on the perspectives from water abundant regions of the country. And as I'll introduce the panel as a whole, and then we'll move through a series of questions. And as a reminder, we do welcome chats that would identify some questions or comments that you would like the panel to consider. And as time allows, we will entertain those. So this panel, it's a panel of 4, and as I mentioned, these are coming from, there are a range of regions of the country, but they all share a more water-rich environment that they're managing. And our focus for this panel is on the drivers and barriers that they're experiencing in each of their respective locations. We are joined by Randy Bartlett, who's the director of the Fairfax County Department of Public Works and Environmental Services. Gary Hawkins, the assistant professor and water resource management specialist at the University of Georgia. Mark Dene, the administrator for Capital Region Watershed District in St. Paul, Minnesota. And Lynn Broaddus, who's president of Broadview Collaborative and the president of the Water Environment Federation. So I'm going to kick this off with a question for each of the panelists to consider. I'll start with Lynn, who comes from 2 perspectives, both as with an expertise in distributed systems and also representing the nationwide perspectives of the Water Environment Federation. to tell us more about the main drivers that she sees behind the interest in stormwater capture and use in the regions that she represents. So Lynn, welcome.
Molly, thanks. It's great to be here with everybody. You know, we're here, most of us are here representing kind of the urban, large city utility perspective or the regulatory perspective or something like that. And I'd like to add into my perspectives, maybe I represent also kind of a community of bootleggers out there, those of us who have been harvesting rainwater for a long time because it's there, sort of like, you know, what we forget that one of the drivers is sort of like the mountain that we climb because it's there. We harvest rainwater because it comes into our life for free, and it's just so obvious. But done, and in my mind, it doesn't get a lot simpler than that. But you know, most of my life has been spent in the temperate parts of the world and with plenty of year-round water supply options. So it's easy for me to think about how we harvest rainwater and how we use it and bring it into our lives. And there are a lot of people out there sort of like me who use it kind of off grid and off the main radar screen. But when we think about these kind of more official and the kinds of perspectives I think are being represented in today's webinar, we share a lot of the same drivers. And one is simply to prevent erosion. You know, flash floods, erosion, polluted runoff, all those things happen because of rainwater. And in essence, our urban and built environments, we've eliminated much of the natural infrastructure that normally absorbs rainwater, the soil and the plants. And in lieu of that, we have these technologies that can capture or soften the blow of that rainwater while producing other good effects. We certainly, with rainwater capture, we reduce the impact on groundwater withdrawals, which in turn are undermining communities with subsidence, saltwater intrusion, and reduced base flow in rivers and streams. With rainwater harvest, we reduce energy use. You know, water is very heavy, and if we capture it close to where it's going to be used, we save the effort of pumping it elsewhere, and we also cut back on the energy embedded in our traditional water infrastructure that has to carry it long distances. You know, and reducing that energy embedded is especially true in the cases of places that have deep wells or are sending their water over tops of mountains to get it to them. We also, by using rainwater, we eliminate many contaminants. Deep groundwater often contains arsenic, radium, and other naturally occurring toxins, which rainwater, you know, we can avoid that with rainwater. We also avoid a lot of agricultural contaminants that get into our groundwater, such as, you know, chemicals or fecal contaminants. And these are problems that may not be a huge issue for urban users, but in rural areas, it's a real plague on wells in rural areas. And then we can also eliminate, with on-site use, we can eliminate a lot of the added chemicals that have to get put into municipal water. And one of the unexpected bonuses, it may not be a big driver for most people, I'm a gardener, it's a driver for me, is that your plants for outdoor use, your plants are happier when you're using rainwater. They don't thrive as well with the chemicals that come in, that we have to put into our municipal water. And any sort of outdoor irrigator, landscape managers who are able to use harvested rainwater will tell you that their plants are happier with rainwater. They're healthier without those chlorine residuals. And interestingly, ice hockey players are also happier when they can skate on ice made from harvested rainwater. It's harder ice, it's faster ice than ice made from traditional municipal water. So there's lots and lots of reasons to and more to be enthusiastic about rainwater harvest. And I'm excited to be part of this conversation today to learn some more myself.
Thanks so much, Lynn, and I'll move next to Randy Bartlett, who brings us a perspective from the East Coast, very different perspective at that. Randy, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so I'm in Fairfax County, Virginia. We're a county about 400 square miles, about 1.2 million people. County's pretty much fully developed, and what we're going through now is a redevelopment and urbanization. We're part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, so have been real focused on nutrients. But most of our local stream impairments are around sediment and our TMDLs around sediment are local streams, and most of that sediment is from in-stream erosion. As we're seeing the redevelopment, it provides both opportunities and challenges. What we see in our residential neighborhoods is the smaller houses of the 50s and 60s coming down or being added on, becoming mansions. So now we're starting to see flooding in our residential communities at the upper ends of our watersheds. But in our suburban areas where we used to have parking lots and one-story buildings, we're now seeing high rises with underground parking, and that's providing an opportunity to put stormwater management in where it did not previously exist. The green infrastructure doesn't fit real well into these real urban areas, and infiltration doesn't work real well in our community because of our soils and such. So we're trying to figure out, how do we manage these higher flows we're seeing in the storms to both protect our streams and to reduce flooding, and shaving the peaks and capturing the peaks and using storage is where we see the future heading and where we're trying to go to. Question is then, once we capture all of that water, what do we do with the water? How do we release the water? And do we need to treat the water before we release it? And that's what we're trying to work through now is, okay, we're starting to capture all this water in different parts of the watershed. We don't want to hold it and wait for the drought. We need to get rid of it for the next storm. How do we go about doing that? And looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Randy. Now we'll move on to Mark Dene, who's going to give us a perspective from back to the Midwest and tell us more about, Mark, the motivations and drivers in your area.
All right, thank you, Molly. Well, again, I'm Mark Dene. I'm the administrator with the Capital Region Watershed District in St. Paul, Minnesota. In Minnesota, a watershed district is a special purpose unit of local government. Our district's about 40 square miles and includes parts of the city of St. Paul and 4 first-ring suburbs. So we all live in a watershed, and we need to manage water on a watershed basis. Our area is 42% impervious cover, and 1 out of every 20 Minnesotans live here. So we're highly urban and fully built out. Ultimately, all of our water drains to the Mississippi River, and many millions of people rely on the Mississippi River for their drinking water. So we all have a role in ensuring that the stormwater runoff that leaves our watershed does not negatively impact someone else's clean, safe drinking water. Of course, as it's been mentioned, stormwater runoff creates impairments in our water bodies, and all of this impervious surface impedes groundwater recharge. So as a watershed district, we are regulators. We are also regulated as an MS4, but we do walk the walk. The photo behind me is our reuse system that we have in our new office building. So we capture the rainwater off the roof. It's filtered and disinfected, and we use it for flushing toilets in our building. So we've been living the reuse world literally in our own building and have some very direct firsthand experience with that. So we are in an area considered an abundant region for water. We average about 30 inches a year of precipitation. And after all, we are the land of 10,000 lakes. However, in 2020, we were about 8 inches below the average, yet in 2019, we were about 8 inches above the average. And so that is the challenge, is, as Randy said, shaving off those peaks and valleys, trying to mitigate those high precipitation years, and then have a reservoir, if you will, for when we go into droughts. Some of the drivers are, it was interesting in seeing the comments from the attendees, but we are in a developmental phase of reuse in our region. So right now, the drivers that we're seeing fundamentally right now is funding. If there's a public grant that is available, that can really help drive these pilot projects in our region. I looked, in 7 of the 10 systems in our watershed receive some form of subsidy or grant to help implement the system. We don't know which ones would have happened without the grant, but we know that that funding is definitely driving some of these installations. So certainly regulations are both a driver and an impediment. In our region, many watershed organizations have a volume reduction standard that typically requires the first inch of rainfall be retained on site. Now, for many developments, that often means some kind of infiltration system. With greater density or problematic soils, reuse becomes a viable option. Reuse is an effective method for water volume control and can also yield benefits for flood reduction. It's also been noted that reducing the runoff volume has a corresponding reduction in the nutrient load and can help with local TMDLs. Also think a driver here is a conservation or sustainability ethic. I think that organizations are looking to do sustainable development, and the water element of those projects are a big component of sustainability. There's a little bit of competition here in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area for having the greenest ballpark. And so Minneapolis and St. Paul both like to tout their local ballparks as the greenest in America. I'm a little biased in supporting St. Paul's CHS Field as the greenest ballpark, but that is driving a lot of the public sector interest in reuse, in fitting in another piece of the sustainability equation for these new developments. More recently, the new Minnesota United Soccer Stadium is using a reuse system, taking water off the roof of the stadium to provide reuse water for the entire super block that the site is located on. And we'll talk further about barriers, but sometimes money is a driver, and it can be a barrier, as is regulations. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And last, I'll turn to Gary. Since it's been a while since I introduced him, as a reminder, he's the Assistant Professor and Water Resource Management Specialist at the University of Georgia. Gary, tell us more about some of the key drivers and motivations that are advancing stormwater capture and use in the Georgia area.
Thanks, Molly. I think some of the things from my perspective, I'm in the Crop Soil Science Department here at the University of Georgia. I'm also, like you said, a water resource management specialist, which that means that I get to work with our county extension agents on water related issues. So that could be urban today, that may be ag tomorrow, or it may be reversed, or it may be both on the same day. So I'm part of a network, if you want to call it that, across the US with all the land grant universities in every state. So my counterparts across the country work with our county extension agents within each county of the US to provide unbiased information from the university out to the homeowners, businesses, and such as that. So the drivers, as I see it from stormwater capture from an agricultural standpoint, gets back to what Lynn said with, as rain falls, if you've got unprotected soil, you get erosion occurring. So part of my stormwater capture, if you want to call it that, with agricultural is trying to get farmers and work with farmers on what they call conservation production or conservation tillage. So you keep residue on the ground at all times. You keep something growing on that ground at all times. So when that rain hits the ground, it infiltrates more than running off. So you reduce that erosion like Lynn was talking about, but you also get that water as a storage mechanism and that recaptured water within the soil profile from when it's available until when the plants might need it. If we're not using conservation tillage, having those farm ponds and using that water that's captured on these farms back for irrigation. So that's a source of irrigation water. So learning how to manage that from irrigation efficiencies and such as that. On the other side of the coin, like I mentioned, I also get to work with urban agents here in Georgia. And so they look at more of what are those stormwater issues in the urban side. So Lynn mentioned it again, rainfall capture. So rain barrels, and how do we use that water in the urban gardens? How do we use that at a house? How do we capture that water? I just got an email yesterday from one of our agents here, wanted me to come talk to the agents here in the northwest corner of the state on how they can better educate their homeowners on rainfall and rainwater capture. So From my perspective, stormwater capture has two different views. How do we do that on the farm to use that water later, but then also use it and capture it in the urban setting through GI systems, through LID systems, and how do we best manage that water? So Molly, I look forward to the rest of the discussion, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Gary, and thanks to everyone for those terrific opening remarks, and in particular, the emphasis on the positives, the real drivers. Obviously, a pretty interesting mix, a conversation that at one point was really dominated in the water abundant regions of the country by discussions of how to manage excess water, flood events, et cetera, has become a much more complex discussion with a lot of different beneficial uses depending on where you are, and you know, a lot different scales that we're starting to see play out. I'm wondering if we also, so that we don't paint too rosy a picture of this, if we also make sure that we're talking about some of the challenges, the barriers that you have seen, and what we need to plan for with those barriers in mind. How do we manage for some of the challenges and hopefully remove some of those barriers in the future as we continue to explore how we can best advance these tools. So I'm going to go back to Mark, Danae, and ask you to kick us off with a discussion of what you see as some of the most challenging difficulties or barriers that you're experiencing. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Molly. So I think regulations was both a motivator and a barrier, and I'm going to talk about it from the barrier side. And again, the system behind me is capturing rainwater off the roof of our building that is used for flushing toilets, outside irrigation, and a bottle washer in our shop. And the requirements in the plumbing code right now, we have two forms of filtration. We have activated carbon, and we have a UV disinfection system. And this is to flush toilets, and you know, there's health code that's driving this, but that creates a very expensive system. And we're flushing toilets with this water that is maybe not to drinking water standards, but very close. And so that's a challenge, and it's really hard to pencil in the return on investment for the private sector to do one of these systems with that level of cost. I don't know if it's been mentioned yet, but the cost of water, especially in Minnesota, but I think around the country, is relatively cheap. Water is cheap. And so an expensive system like this, it's really hard to demonstrate that return on investment dollar for water saved. So there has to be these other motivations like a subsidy or that sustainability ethic that comes in place. So this is water being brought in. Right now, there's an analysis going on water from ponds being used for irrigation, which is probably the largest use of reuse in our region. And right now, it's currently not regulated if it's not applied on a non-food application. But I think there's some expectation that there could be regulations on water quality, and just not knowing that regulatory uncertainty is cause for concern in our region. So I'm not advocating for regulations, but the likelihood or specter of regulations is creating some concern in our region. Our initial, I'm just going to mention too that the initial look at reuse in Minnesota had a very heavy emphasis on public health, and that's very important. I think that we need to balance that with water resource protection, groundwater recharge as well.
Terrific. Thanks, Mark. I'm going to turn to Randy next, and then Lynn. Randy.
So I actually wanted to ask a question of Mark. One of the things we've been using our reuse water for in some of the urban areas is cooling water for the air conditioning and heating systems and stuff. And then we've also used it for irrigation. We built a 300,000 gallon underground storage tank at one of our high schools, and we use it for irrigating the fields. But one of the challenges we're having is we want to get these systems emptied before the next big storm comes in, so that we can capture either the first flush or shave the peak of the storm. And we've had a real hard time trying to figure out how do you balance trying to empty that tank behind you quickly, versus, having water that you can use? So how do you go about doing that?
Well, that's a great question, Randy. And one thing we built into our system is an Opti real-time controller, that adaptive controller. We put them in several of our stormwater ponds already, and the real-time controllers anticipate storm events. And so in an outdoor pond application, it can lower a pond a set amount to have additional capacity for a storm event. We applied that to our rainwater harvesting system. So if we're going to overflow the system, we can drain that out. It goes into a bioretention basin, infiltrates back into the ground, and then we have an empty tank to absorb that storm event. But the Weather Service isn't 100%, so we've drained our tank a couple times and then didn't get the rain that we were expected. But that's a real-time controller system that are becoming more popular in stormwater management is the way to do that.
Yeah, and that's been one of the hard sells we've had with our businesses, our community, and even within our own agency is that we need to be automating stormwater. And for so many years, there was just no automation on stormwater. And we're starting to put that in, and we're starting to see some of the challenges of it all. So.
Great. Thanks, Randy and Mark, on that. I'm going to turn to Lynn next for some comments, and in particular, recognizing that we were just discussing some of the larger systems and challenges and barriers associated, that it's also, there are also some that we're seeing in terms of small distributed and on-site systems. Lynn.
Yeah, I just want to kind of really highlight what Mark said. I think you really raised an important conundrum that we're in right now. And I view this as maybe part of the growing pains that we have to work our way through. But, we have this push-pull, all very well-meaning and for good reasons, but between the desire to reuse water, we got lots of reasons to need to do that. And that's coming from the water sector, and the drivers are around water. And then at the other side, we have the pull of state health departments, which want to make sure that their goal is to protect human health, particularly from in this case, from biological contaminants, viruses, and harmful bacteria. And the overkill that you're having to go through in that system that you illustrated, Mark, and it does cost a fair amount of money to be able to treat toilets. It reminds me of a number of years ago, the Urban Ecology Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was a real pioneer in trying to harvest rainwater to use for non-potable uses within their building. And the state plumbing code did not allow for it. And they fought and fought and fought and finally got an exception, but they had to they could only use it, they're only using it in their toilets, but they still had to dual plumb everything and they still had to treat all that toilet water with chlorine. And it just made no sense. But it was done, the state required it from just wanting to err on the side of caution. And I think as we get more experience with this, I hope we will find where that middle ground is, and what is good enough to be safe enough, and how much do we really need to do it if we're just going to use it to flush toilets, or can we take it just one little step further and actually use it for potable use? And I would argue that we probably can. And there are a lot of smaller systems. Certainly there are a lot of smaller systems that are doing much what Mark is doing, but on a smaller scale. But there are also a lot of small systems, particularly in rural areas, that have a mini version of what Mark has, and those people are using it for potable use. And but they're not regulated in the same way, and that's why they can do that. I'm one of those people in my cottage in Virginia, and I'm certainly not alone. There's thousands of us that do that. So I think in time we'll find that way, but it's painful right now.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm going to turn to Dave Smith, who we may have time for one more question for the panel. Any that you're tracking that we should add in here?
Quick, Molly, we've received a couple of similar questions that are probing this issue about figuring out the right level of treatment for stormwater in different kinds of use and reuse, ranging from landscape irrigation and how much do you need to treat for that, to use in building settings, as the panel's been discussing. And I'll just note that in the next webcast that we're going to put on in this series, we are going to focus specifically on efforts going on nationally to develop stormwater specific treatment standards and kind of explore where that might go to address this kind of need. But I think the panel's done a good job already of discussing some of those regulatory issues that some of the questioners have brought up in the chat room.
Terrific. Okay. So not hearing anything anyone wants to add to that issue and or observations about how to overcome some of those challenges. Okay, I'm not going to push too hard on that one. I'd like to take maybe just do a short reflection, I'd like to leave time for each panel member who would like to share a perspective on a vision for the future. So when you think about your area of expertise, your window into what's most important, is there an example or a factor or something that you think about that's really key or that characterizes your vision of the future for how we approach or how we, once we're successful integrating stormwater capture and use into our systems? I'm going to start with Gary, and I'll give everyone a chance to offer a brief thought about your vision for the future. Gary.
So, thanks, Molly. So again, on both sides of it, so agriculture, I think increasing that use of, like I mentioned, conservation tillage, conservation production. So we capture that water in place. And if we don't let it leave the land, then we don't have to deal with it later. And then I know irrigation is becoming more and more efficient. So just improving that in the future as we go forward. On the urban side, then how do we use that water we captured in a better way? So can we use that in our home gardens like Lynn's been talking about? Do we use it for, reuse like Mark's been talking about? How do we best use that? And from my education aspect, how do we better educate our public and those citizens to know how to use the rain gardens and the cisterns and those things in the urban setting, as well as the ag settings from agricultural production methods? So with that, Molly, I'll turn it over to everybody else.
Thanks, Gary. Randy, to you next.
So I think capture of the stormwater is going to become much more popular. I think we're finding, our developers are finding that's cheaper than some of the other alternatives. They're building four levels of parking underground and then taking 1 or 2 spaces for storage is actually pretty cheap. I think it's something that we can treat, and we know the quality of it coming out, and we know the quantity that we're capturing, so it makes it a lot easier to manage than some of the other systems we're trying to use. I think automation is going to be a real key as we move forward. We're using the same system Mark mentioned on a couple of our ponds, where the ponds stay shut during the storm and then open up 24 hours after the storm, and I think that's going to become a key piece. And I think we're going to see our stormwater and our wastewater systems get linked together. As we're seeing wastewater flows decrease and wastewater strengths increase, I see us using stormwater off-peak times to actually flush the wastewater system, dilute it a little bit, stabilize the flows. We're also doing reuse with our treatment plants, which are at the lower end of the county, so we have to move that water back up. The stormwater we're capturing in the upper part of the county, and somehow we'll figure out how to balance those two systems together. So I think a lot's going to change in the next 20 years.
Thanks, Randy. I'm going to put a flag that I'd like to come back to this issue of integration with the third panel when both of the groups are together. So let's try to make some time to dig into that a little bit more. Lynn.
Well, I'm not sure if this exactly answers your question, but one of the things that I've been thinking about, sort of the forward looking and around stormwater harvest, is thinking about other components in our built environment, and particularly roof materials. And one of the things that I would love to see happen as time goes by is that we start moving towards more frequent use of roofing materials that lend themselves to better quality rainwater. Of course, that helps any kind of stormwater runoff, but it especially impacts and benefits the situations where we're trying to reuse it in that immediate context.
Great, thanks, Lynn. And Mark, why don't you wrap up this panel for us with some parting thoughts about your vision for the future?
Thanks, Molly. Well, I think, with living in a system for the last few years, I'm really seeing that the economics have got to start working in favor of reuse to a much larger degree. We can have the ethics. We need to keep working on that, but I'm really seeing economic drivers can really help this. It needs to become mainstream where there is a return on investment, and so it becomes much more natural. I think this is like recycling was 20 or more years ago. We don't even think about it now. We have separate containers for our aluminum cans and paper. And when we all realize that rainwater is a resource and not a waste product, it will really galvanize the need to do that. And the regulation and economics really need to then come into balance so that this is just an everyday practice.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to the whole panel number 1 on water abundant regions of the country. Terrific way to kick off this discussion, and we'll plan to bring you back into the 3rd panel and look forward to some of your reflections along with the water scarce perspectives from the country in a more integrated conversation in a few minutes. All right, so we are going to now shift and bring on the lovely faces of our 2nd panel. I'll introduce the whole panel to start. We have, again, 4 experts who are joining us. I'll start with Charlene Lurig, who is the Executive Director of the Texas Water Trade and Austin Water Forward. Shahram Karagani, who is the Acting Assistant General Manager for the LA Sanitation and Environment. Amanda Carr, who's Deputy Director for Orange County Department of Public Works and the Chair of the California Stormwater Quality Association. And Dick Luthi, who is both the Director of Renew It, Reinventing Our Nation's Water Infrastructure, which is an NSF research center, and a professor at Stanford University. So similar to the last panel, we're going to use a structured set of questions, and we'll open up with one that is going to sound familiar. We'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves and the perspectives that they're bringing to this conversation by telling us more about the local drivers behind interest in stormwater capture and use in your area, the perspectives you represent. So I will start with Shahram Karagani. Shahram, you're going to kick off for us. You all set?
Yes.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Molly. Hello to everyone from the city of Angels. Beautiful 70-degree outside. But as you could imagine, water is a scarce commodity in Southern California where we live. As a result of that, currently, as I'm speaking with you, almost 90% of our water for our region, for Southern California, is being imported. And the breakdown is 38% from Sierra Nevada via Los Angeles Aqueduct, 41% from Bay Delta, and 8% from Colorado River. These supplies are augmented with local groundwater of approximately 10% and recycled water of 2%. Importing water is an energy intensive and expensive and not sustainable at the current level. As you could imagine, 90% of our water coming from faraway places. So this is not a sustainable plan. So as a result of that, we are working right now to make, I come from a department that has all of the 3 resources under one department: wastewater system, one of the largest in the nation, and then we have the stormwater, and then we have the solid resources. All those programs are under one department. So we are using every drop of water that we create in our wastewater system to become recycled, so we could use that to address the water need of the 4 million Angelinos that we have in our city. The other driver is our permit. The city of Los Angeles has 22 TMDLs that we have to comply with. And you could imagine 22 TMDLs covers from bacteria during both dry and wet weather to other pollutants such as PCBs, DDTs, metals, nutrients, so on and so forth right now. So that would be another driver for us right now. We have been opportunistic for the past 10 years of implementing close to $600 million worth of what we call distributed regional and distributed green projects to make sure that the city becomes not only cleaner water and also greener. Currently, we have worked with our water board, one of the best water board in the nation, Region 4. We have negotiated a permit that incentivize our planning by providing us watershed management program that we work with the co-permitters in the watershed to create these plans and implement them using green multi-benefit strategy. And last but not least, we are one of the best low impact development in the nation. Anybody that wants to develop or add a room or what have you to their development, they have to do low impact development and they have to get permit through our system right now. I'm gonna pause there, Molly, right now as a response to other questions that come later on.
Sharam, thanks so much. That's terrific. I'll turn next to a perspective from Texas. Charlene Lurig, thank you for joining us.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. So a little bit about me. I am Chief Executive Officer of Texas Water Trade. We're a nonprofit that works statewide to catalyze environmental water markets with the objective of allowing our state to grow as it is quite rapidly right now, as it will continue to, and to do so in a way that still allows for abundant water for people and for nature. Texas is a little bit different from some of the other Western states that folks in the chat room have been discussing, Colorado and New Mexico, where there are limitations on the amount of water that you can use or the timing on which you can hold water that's fallen on your property in the form of rain. Here in Texas, there really is no limit. And as long as the water has not touched what's described as a bed or a bank, then at which point it becomes water that is owned by the state of Texas and is already appropriated, you as a private property owner have the right to use that water. And so for us as a nonprofit focused on water for people and nature, that along with other on-site water resources is really important when we think about how we provide water in ways that don't allow us or force us into a position of having to take more water from rivers or more water from aquifers. Water flowing in rivers in Texas comes from aquifers. It's a groundwater fed system that gets refueled, so to speak, by rainfall. So starting in 2014, I also had the ability to begin participating as a volunteer here in the city of Austin, where I live, in what became the 100-year water supply plan for the city of Austin called Water Forward. And that was really the opportunity that allowed me to understand how deep the water resources are, how substantial they are when we look on site at downscaled water infrastructure, when we look beyond what we have appropriated and what we model out in our state water planning process. When we look at just surface water or groundwater, we were faced with the prospect of planning for 100 years of water supply through that planning process for a population that would quadruple in size to 4 million by the year 2115. And as a city, we kind of set a standard for ourselves that we wanted to design a portfolio that would be robust and resilient to climate change, but also allow us to provide reliable water to our population without taking water from surrounding communities. In Texas, as with much of the other parts of the West, water has traditionally been resourced through an import model. So you extend your pipelines further and farther afield, and we wanted to instead look at how we could be self-sustaining. When I think about stormwater, I'm not just thinking about stormwater in terms of that one resource on a property. Part of what I look forward to exploring with you all today is the economics of opening it up to looking at all forms of on-site water. And so air conditioning, condensate, stormwater, rainwater, gray water, black water, all of those things are baked into our portfolio for the next 100 years. And over that period of time, we anticipate that we have the opportunity to have as much as 30% of our future additional water supplies come from those on-site water resources. So it's incredibly ambitious. We're in the process of figuring out how to do that, and looking forward to learning from you all today.
Thanks, Charlene. I'll go next to Amanda, also from a region in Southern California, similar to Shahram's perspective, but very different in many ways. So we're interested in hearing more about the contrast between your two very closely located, but different kinds of contexts. Amanda, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Molly. Yes, I am Shahram's neighbor to the south. I work for Orange County Public Works. Orange County is roughly 800 square miles. We've got about 35 miles of coastline. We've got about 3.2 million people. So the little sister to LA and sandwiched in between San Diego, but we're primarily a very urbanized county. To the north, we have good groundwater resources. So about 2/3 of our water supply comes from groundwater resources. The southern part of the county, similar to what Shahram was citing, is almost 100% imported water. So we are in the Mediterranean climate of Southern California. I get a whopping 11 inches of rain a year. And generally that rain comes from October through February in a series of very flashy storms. So for the vast majority of our year, we're sunny. As with Shahram, I have a beautiful sunny Southern California 70-degree day going on right now. But also in contrast to Shahram, the county, as well as the 34 cities in Orange County, in general, on the majority, we do not provide water and sewer. So we are the stormwater agencies. We have the stormwater regulations, but we do not have sewering agencies or water supply agencies. So when we do stormwater capture and diversion, which we do, we have been implementing. The county itself operates 3 existing diversions. We are negotiating a 4th that has been constructed, but it's not operational. And we're the funding partner, but not the operator on a 5th. And multiple beach cities are running, I would say, between 10 and 15 different diversion locations along the beach, along our coast. And our primary driver is NPDES stormwater compliance. Similar to Shahram, we have a host of TMDLs. Also similar to Shahram, our NPDES permits actually have numeric effluents, so, numeric targets for our compliance. So diversion to the sanitary sewer is one of the few treatment options that actually meets numeric targets. As we know, a lot of the green infrastructure and LID, which we are also implementing, and stormwater capture in other areas doesn't necessarily get us to water quality numeric targets, but stormwater diversion, dry weather runoff capture definitely does. So those are really the primary drivers for us. However, in order to make stormwater diversion work, we have to partner with our local sewering agencies and our local water agencies on where that water can either be captured and treated and discharged via ocean outfall, although that's very much going away, and the majority of our capture is now happening, being treated through our partnership with the Orange County Sanitation District, and then is being sent to the Orange County Water District for groundwater replenishment and potable reuse after infiltration back into the groundwater aquifer. So those are primarily the drivers that we're working with.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Now we move further up the coast in California to another California, but very different conditions in the San Francisco Bay Area. Richard Luthi, thanks for joining us, and tell us more about some of the key drivers and motivations in your
Yes,
region.
thank you, Molly, and thank you, Amanda, and others for your comments today. Well, we're in the Bay Area. Much of our water supply is imported. I'll use the example for the water that comes right here to my house on the Stanford campus. It comes from the SFPUC system. That's water that's taken from the Tuolumne River. And during the last drought we had, we were asked to reduce our water consumption by 25%. Now, in future droughts, we may be asked to go as much as 50%. And that's to leave more water in the Tuolumne River for fish. And so this is a big driver that's out there in front of us. So when we think about stormwater, I think number one driver is water supply. And how can we better capture and use that? We don't have the best geology in the Bay Area. I can talk about that later. Shahram has better opportunities in San Fernando Valley and the like. But there's stuff that we can do. The whole idea is to reduce the need for imported water, become more self-sufficient. Another one is water quality. Here, we don't have the beach environment like in LA and Orange County and San Diego, but there is a lot of interest in protecting the bay for habitat and recreation and scenic beauty and the like. So here, the people in the Bay Area in the 9 counties in 2016 passed a parcel tax for all of us to contribute to help keep the bay clean, prevent pollution, and protect and restore habitats. And that's another motivation for how we tackle our stormwater problems. Not as much money as in LA with Measure W, something to come back and talk about. But the point is, in LA and up here, both initiatives passed with over 2/3 of the vote. I just want to say one thing more about the cost, and this gets back to the issue with back east. Here, because we're in the Bay Area and right around the fringe of the bay, we don't have the good geology for infiltration. So it's likely capture, treat, and recharge. And that might be a little bit expensive. It might be on the order of $500 to $1,000 an acre foot. But our wholesale cost of water is $1,800 an acre foot. So it's very cost attractive, or it's very cost efficient. In terms of our import water, there's just not more we can go get. It's not like, Dave Smith, if I had another $1,800, could you give me an acre foot? There isn't, that's the wrong comparison. It's what can we do now? And there's good reasons it can be very cost effective and it can make a difference. Perhaps in the Bay Area, maybe 10 to 12% of our future water supply, if I had to guess. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Dick. I understand that Molly may have lost her internet connection, so I'm going to sub for her temporarily. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm going to ask a couple of follow-up questions. Looks like Molly may have come back. Are you back with us?
Thank you. So sorry about that.
We just finished up the first round of question and responses, and so we can go on to our next set of questions for this panel.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Dave, for filling in. So similar to the last panel, we wanted to now do a round, open it up to those of you who have thoughts about some of the challenges and barriers that you're facing in each of your respective conditions. I have been seeing some really interesting chat comments about environmental uses and others. So as you see opportunities to be addressing some of these kinds of interest areas, please feel free to chime in on those also. So on the barriers and difficulties, I'm going to kick off with Charlene. Can you start off that discussion?
Sure. Well, one, I want to thank everybody who was involved in the group that put together the on-site water reuse kind of regulatory permitting pathway document. That's been of tremendous value to us here in Texas, who are operating in an environment that, again, is in very stark contrast to what I'm learning about some of you today, where you're very tightly regulated. have very little room for opportunity to use stormwater for a variety of end uses. In Texas, it's really the opposite. There's relatively little regulation in many places. And here in Austin, we've used that document to improve the expectations and standards within the city as we start to enable and incentivize more developers to use stormwater alongside other types of waters that have their own kind of pathogen profiles and do so in a way that protects the public health. So fortunately, I'll say with that document in hand, that's not one of our primary impediments. But one of the things that we're struggling with as we go through the process of it as a city of adapting our land code to require buildings of a certain size, typically large developments, large campuses, to begin providing their own non-potable water. This is something that we are in the process of doing. It's modeled in many ways on what the city of San Francisco has done for some time for their through their non-potable reuse ordinance. One of the challenges that we're grappling with, and where I hope we can provide value to others, is understanding how you actually pay for those on-site water systems. So this is the dual plumbing. It's the on-site water treatment system that's required to deal with whatever the contaminants are in the water that's being used, either outside for irrigation, depending on how you're irrigating, or inside the building for toilet flushing and cooling systems and the like. And that can be a fairly substantial upfront cost. Part of what's attractive about on-site water is that in a lot of places where you look at the combined cost of drinking water, potable water, and wastewater, on-site water, including stormwater, can be less expensive on a per unit basis. But much like with on-site solar, you have this weird kind of inverse setup where the capital requirement is all put onto the developer upfront to bring that new resource online. And we know that that's created challenges in the energy space. We anticipate it will create challenges here. We're already in an environment where we have increasing costs of housing. And so there's a real policy discussion around if we mandate these developments, which could include multifamily, residential, it could include affordable housing. To what extent are we just, creating more cost pressures on households that are already challenged here? So we've been working with the Austin Water Utility and some other groups, including the PACE Authority of Texas, to look at one particular financing mechanism that's been used, I think, in a lot of your communities, as well as here in the state of Texas, property assessed clean energy financing, which basically allows you to cash flow the savings that are presented by on-site energy generation or energy efficiency projects, water conservation projects in the traditional sense. And we're right now going through kind of the costing and forecasting process, looking at a variety of building types, looking at a variety of types of source water and indoor and outdoor uses for that water to figure out whether or not you could actually comply with the requirements of PACE financing. And that's very interesting because it basically means that development is not having to use their working capital to build these water treatment systems or the dual plumbing. And it also means that utilities, including Austin, which is making $1 million a year available over 3 years for grants to kind of get these systems off the starting blocks. San Francisco has offered these sorts of grants. Some of your communities may as well. That's working utility capital, right? And so if there's a way to kind of cash flow this in a way that in some ways kind of mimics how we've debt financed our traditional water infrastructure, we think that that could be a really important way of uncorking the potential for on-site water reuse, including stormwater.
Thanks, Charlene. I don't see any other hands up, so feel free to if you'd like to. I'm going to direct a question to Amanda. I see you unmuting. I know that there are a couple of things that I wanted to follow up on. One has to do with just the partnerships. You've alluded in the past to the importance that both the barrier and also the solution of the need for partnerships as you're addressing some of these options. I also want to flag that I've heard some perspectives on the challenges of working within siloed agencies, which is related, I think. Mm-hmm. So yeah, maybe you can share some reflections for us. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, I have a perfect example. So everybody cites funding, I mean, going back to the original challenges that the slide that Dave presented at the beginning, funding was the first one. I think second was sort of public perception and perhaps decision maker perception. And then the third one was regulatory. So one of the projects that I have been a partner in was a joint diversion pipeline that was built by two cities, a flood control district, Caltrans, IRWD, and the Orange County Flood Control District. And we all partnered together because multiple, we all had the same regulatory drivers. We were facing we have a TMDL for selenium. There is no treatment to remove selenium. Selenium is an element. You can't transform it. The only thing that you can do is remove it. And through extremely expensive processes, but we had several discharge points where we had groundwater seepage that was containing selenium that needed to be captured. They weren't near a sanitary sewer, so we had to build a pipeline. So we all had the same regulatory driver that none of us we couldn't move the water to the sanitation district individually, but we all partnered together to build a pipeline to connect to the sanitary system. And Orange County Sanitation District luckily was able to accept our water from us. However, they have concerns because they have limits on how much selenium they can discharge at the end of their pipe. So what I would, the blessing and the curse is you can oftentimes, when people have the same regulatory drivers, they can come together to build the project, but the realization has to be made that the contaminants don't go away. We are generally moving them from one regulatory silo to another regulatory silo. And if you're passing your regulatory risk onto the next agency, they're not always really excited about taking that on. And for people who sit on the boards of those agencies, they generally will understand that there's a regulatory risk and just want to shy away from it. So actually, Dave and I have been in other conversations outside, in this whole process of looking at where are those, where are those regulatory risks and how can that clarification be made? I'm just seeing a comment here about selenium in treatment wetlands. We looked through that was not an option for us, particularly with the levels and the forms of selenium that we were dealing with. We also don't have the land area to have a treatment wetland. We're a very urbanized area, and we just don't have the large area to store and treat water in that manner. So hopefully I got to all of those issues.
Great. And I do want to I'll give Dick and Shram the next opportunity, but I am seeing also some questions that I think can be clumped together around a little more on this issue of the barriers associated or the challenges associated with the downstream delivery requirements, environmental flow requirements. I think that those are somewhat related and certainly related to some of what Charlene has been talking about, and Dick, what you mentioned in your opening comments about the drivers associated with the Tuolumne and needs from the Tuolumne. So maybe I could turn to you next.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to the challenges that we have in a Mediterranean climate. Basically, rain barrels don't work for us. They'd be empty all year round. And it's not possible really on a piece of property to put a tank big enough to hold the water for use, 6 or 7 months later. So the challenge for us is one of capture, treat, and recharge, where the ground becomes your rain barrel, so to speak. If you're fortunate to have a lake nearby, like at Stanford, what we do here is we reverse pump our stormwater up to Little Felt Lake, and we can capture up to about 60 acre-feet a year. That addresses the hydromodification issue that we would otherwise face with our discharge to nearby streams. So this whole idea about what would this system look like in a Mediterranean climate? How would it build out? How can we take advantage of existing infrastructure? And I think, Amanda, you got a good point about that with the dry weather flows. That's wonderful. And then there are these water quality issues. If we put a lot of stormwater in the ground from the urban environment, it does raise questions about how clean does that have to be. And when we think of the urban environment, we're not, it's freeways, it's strip malls, it's gas stations, it's everything. So we have to understand how, if we're going to do this large scale infiltration, what kind of treatment is needed to protect our groundwater. That's an issue up here and certainly down in LA as well.
Great, thanks, Dick. So let me, we're just about out of time for this panel, and I'm leaning towards, I've seen, Shahram, anything you want to add on this issue of the barriers and constraints from the perspective of LA?
Just wanted to add, obviously, everyone, as far as barriers would be funding because the city is so large, but keep in mind the history of this right now. Back in 70s, when we went to our wastewater system, federal government provided 2/3 funding, but by the time it came to stormwater in 1980s, there was no funding right now. Lots of obligation as far as pollution in our surface water, but no funding from federal government right now. The city of LA, when you look at the ratepayers twice within 10 years of each other, they passed two funding sources, Proposition $500 million, and then Proposition, Measure W at $300 million a year. So our ratepayers, our citizens are thirsty for environmental, stewardship and clean water. It is up to the government, us, to make sure that, we provide them what they have voted for. Through green multi-benefit projects, and of course, both on the capital side, how we spend money to create them, and then with their input, and then how we use operation and maintenance to maintain them. Thank you.
If I could add a footnote, and Measure W was described as safe, clean water program. And, and that really captures the imagination of the public.
Terrific. Okay, I'm going to open it up. Any last comments from this panel? I'm not going to direct a pointed question at this point. Because we're going to move on to a combined a panel next, and we're going to pull some questions that are coming up in the chat for that. Let me open it up to any additional reflections. Charlene, I see you're unmuted. I'll go to you next.
Yeah, sure. So I know we can't get deep into the question on flows and what stormwater use or storage means for downstream communities or for the environment, but I put a little bit of info in the chat that really just kind of shares my perspective and learning that really it's a question of timing. They're primarily what you're looking at through that kind of stormwater capture infiltration paradigm, as I think Dick mentioned as well, is a matter of kind of shaving peaks, slowing flows, looking at the opportunity for the use to be the basin itself, but you're assisting that basin in replicating the timing that it would have experienced in a more natural hydrograph before we disrupted it in the ways that we've built our urban environments. And that's very basin specific, but there's some good projects out there, small scale here in Austin. There's one called Waller 3 that's a joint cooperative between the water utility and watershed protection department. I would love to learn about projects that have been advanced in other places around the country that are larger scale. We need those here in Texas too, and this is a great forum to be able to share some of that learning. So thank you.
I'd like to add one.
Great.
Oh,
that's okay. I also see Amanda's unmuted. So Dick, I'll let you go and then we'll end with Amanda.
Oh, sure. I'd like to say a challenge for us is how to quantify the co-benefits. And co-benefits can be thought of leaving water for ecosystem flows, having greater water supply resiliency, greening the city, for example. These are all things that are very important. And if you can quantify them, it makes stormwater capture and use in our area really cheap, except we don't quantify them. We tend to cost what we can, pipes and pumps and that sort of thing. So we need a better job of really coming to grips with quantifying the co-benefits. When the right thing is done, everybody knows it and values it.
I'd agree with you, Dick, but I would also say part of the problem with that is it is very situationally specific. What I have seen in, I did 2 of these large diversion cooperative projects over the span of about 10 years. And one was started before the drought and one was started deeply into the drought. Guess which one had the water district willing to pay money into the construction of the diversion? It was the second one. So I very much agree with you that I think, particularly in the arid Southwest, as we're seeing impacts from drought, as we're looking at what are the other sources of water that we can tap into for other uses. It doesn't necessarily have to be direct potable, although Orange County does have the ability to go for potable reuse, but we also have a lot of water recycling, which obviously if you're using that for your irrigation, that takes stresses off of your drinking water system. Some of the things like that Sharam mentioned as well of if you're seeing decreased flows, actually it wasn't Sharam, it was somebody from the previous panel, if you're seeing decreased flows in your wastewater system and you need additional flows, but my wastewater partners are telling me that's not across the board. Some areas are seeing decreased flows within their system and increased strength and need water. Not all wastewater systems are the same. Not all water suppliers have the same challenges. So unfortunately, you then end up having to quantify those benefits on a project by project basis. And that's just more time and money. And then one last barrier that I think a lot of people have touched on, but I do want to bring up particularly in our area, I am hearing a lot of concern from both California and US Fish and Wildlife Services about the capture and diversion of stormwater, both during wet weather and during dry weather, as starving streams and wetlands of needed water for habitat. So then stormwater folks end up being caught between water quality regulation saying you can't discharge water during dry weather, and resource agencies saying you can't cut off that water supply. So those are 2 competing things that we find when we're starting to look at having more application of the diversion of both stormwater in dry and wet weather.
Great. I'm going to take advantage of this pause. I love the energy, and let's keep this conversation going and continue to be tracking the chat. I'm going to raise a couple of things to do just that. But while I'm doing this, Eliza, will you bring the 3rd full panel together so that we can start bringing some more voices into these next questions? And the intent here, as a reminder, is to bring these 2 perspectives, water scarce and more water abundant situations, together to talk about some of the issues that actually do cut across them. And our first question, I'm going to modify this slightly. So panelists, you're going to have to be on your toes here just a little bit. But we're going to start with a question where we'd like you to chime in with some observations about what you're hearing from your peers about the important differences. Regional differences, difference in scale is starting to come up in the chat. So smaller communities that are dealing with some of these issues are perhaps very different than some of the larger urban areas that we have focused a little bit more on so far. What are you starting to hear as you think about the opportunities and challenges and the differences as we look across these regions, across these communities? I'd like to open this up more to bring in more perspectives on this. Anybody want to kick off with what you're thinking about as you're listening to your colleagues? I see Gary unmuted, so I'll start with you, Gary.
So thanks, Molly. So I know Amanda was just talking about the diversion and how and when you divert water, you get into the environmental and the ecological side of it. I mean, here in Georgia, we get 52 inches of rain per year. So, you know, Amanda, I think you said 11 inches is what you guys get. I came to a conference over there years ago, and everybody were saying y'all were getting 6 inches of rain versus 52. So while I was there talking about TMDLs, but we've been going through the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years here in Georgia, water management. We don't have watershed regions. We do have sort of watershed regions, but we don't have council areas or whatnot. But a lot of times when we talk about diverting water in the upstream, that affects the agricultural side downstream, because if our wastewater treatment plants don't put water back into those creeks and rivers, then that agricultural need further down the creek or the river is not available. Also, it gets back to what Amanda was saying too, that if we keep diverting some of that water upstream, then the ecological downstream doesn't have that water it needs. So, I mean, even here in 48, 49, 50 inches of rain per year, diverting that water has some consequences to it.
Thanks,
I
Gary.
wonder, Molly, is it okay if I jump in with a question? One of the things that struck me as we've had these conversations in Texas and as I've listened to them in other places is we start with larger concepts and words because everybody's kind of getting familiar with them. But then where the rubber really hits the road kind of requires us to finesse and differentiate. And so, for example, there may be an opportunity to reduce the impact that you have on downstream users of water or on the environment if what you're doing is intercepting rainwater at a small decentralized scale. Obviously, if you maximize the amount of total rainwater that can be captured, you have a phenomenal amount of water. But the difference between rainwater at a decentralized scale, like a rooftop, versus stormwater in a large system is a lot of the rainwater that falls on a rooftop never enters into the hydrology of the basin. It's lost in the form of evapotranspiration. And so it was never water that was really there for flows. It was never water that was really there for people downstream in an appropriated water system. So I think it's really important to be fine-grained in the way that we talk about what type of water, where is it intercepted, at what scale, and that the outcome of those things is not all the same. Stormwater is not stormwater. It depends on the scale, the diversion point, and where it's captured.
Thanks, Charlene. I'll go to Randy next. Thanks for your patience, Randy.
This has been real helpful. I mean, in preparing for this session and then listening to the session, the thing I come away with is we all have similar goals about water quality in the environment and keeping the base flows that we need and managing the peak flows that we shouldn't have and temperature and all the different pieces. And we all have similar technologies. Of course, we're all learning about those technologies from each other and stuff, but there's very different cost benefit formulas and very different financial drivers that we're all facing. So this kind of project by project is real important, but being able to share it all and to get it all in kind of a comprehensive, get it all together so that as we talk the same way, we use the same words, and we can explain to our elected officials, our constituents, why I can't do what they're doing in Orange County, why we don't want to do that, but how we can use the same tools of potentially using an integrated sewer system with our stormwater system. And, how what we're hearing from the Northwest about maintaining the minimum stream flows, this idea of capturing the water off the parking lots and putting it in a tank and letting it mix and manage the temperatures a little bit instead of just discharging it straight to the stream where the temperature shoot up really helps with our water quality. And then when we start using the automation that we hear from Mark, we can start to release that water back to the stream and replace the dry weather flows that were in our streams that are gone because of the impervious surfaces. So we really need to figure out, how do we get our arms around it, all get the same language, get the same tools, and then be able to explain why these tools are appropriate for our area and why these tools may not be appropriate for our area or how we use them.
Dick, were you unmuted? Did you have something you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm hearing here is there isn't one size that fits all. It's clear that there are regional differences. You know, the way I think about California, it's so, you know, the Bay Area is different than LA, that's different than Orange County, that's different than San Diego. San Diego really doesn't have very little stormwater. I guess if there was someone here, they could say maybe they get 5 inches of rain a year and they don't have the right geology for infiltration. I think something that we can learn from is to create stormwater master plans that go beyond a city, but encompass a broad area. And then you can think about how can things build out and work to help meet your water quality or your water supply challenges in the future. And then there was some, Brian Hummel had a question about carbon sequestration. I think as we treat stormwater, we can look at green tech and the role that it might play. One thing we're very much interested in is how we can use biochar, you know, well-made biochar to help filter contaminants from stormwater. Something we hope that something we hope to test down in LA too.
Thanks,
Molly,
Dick.
I just wanted to
Shram, yeah.
comment also on what Amanda mentioned regarding removing the water from our creeks and rivers. Obviously, you know, Amanda, for the city of LA, before we do any of these things, that we do a water balance analysis to make sure how much water is needed for the habitat, for ecosystem, before we divert a drop of water to our system, because we have done water conservation, and some of our wastewater pipes right now are running empty, and that creates another challenge as far as, you know, corrosion and what have you. So that was regarding that. Dick also mentioned the issue of quantification. He's right, because the stormwater pollution comes from humans right now. So if we could quantify right now, when I say multi-purpose project, if we could quantify how much water am I cleansing, how much water supply am I creating, how much greenery am I creating in order to deal with the climate change. For LA, I don't know elsewhere right now. For Los Angeles right now, the issues on top of everything else we have said is environmental justice right now, disadvantaged community. The city is urbanized right now. We cannot have treatment plant in the backyard of the bunch of communities. So green infrastructure was the only way to move forward, because that was the most acceptable, you know, to the folks that live around this system that we are talking about. So it is important to be aware of those other challenges that we have in our communities. Thank you.
I'd like to give a shout out to LA with the Sun Valley neighborhood and the park, and then also with the Roy M. Shaw Wetlands is being built. That's providing community amenities in a place that really didn't have very many before.
Thank you, Dick.
Lynn.
Yeah, well, first I want to just kind of acknowledge it over here in the chat. I mean, there's such a rich discussion going on in the chat, and especially there have been a number of questions around distributed and small scale harvest and kind of how to, and the regulations there, and what people kind of have done for a long time in places like Puerto Rico and Hawaii, the Virgin Islands, those sorts of places. And I just want to acknowledge that the technologies for point of use and small scale water reuse, whether it's rainwater harvest like we're talking about, which technologically is not that difficult to clean, versus wastewater, you know, what goes down our toilet. But even those technologies are, you know, starting to come along for small scale use. So that's just a really rich area that someday maybe we can explore that separately. But I kind of wanted to lift up the original question was around some of the differences between dry regions versus wet regions, and in places where you know, like where Shram and Amanda work, the need to reuse and capture that water and use it as best one can, those are natural drivers. And so it kind of forces, even when the utility functions may be separate, stormwater may be separate from water supply and wastewater, but in other areas of the country, just because there's a lot of rainwater doesn't mean that it's not water stressed in some way. And I think in particular the impact to groundwater resources. There's so many communities that rely on groundwater, and yet they have water falling out of the sky that they could be using. Yeah, but so I think of, like, I'm thinking of some like coastal South Carolina where I have family, and the houses are kind of far apart, yet they're all on city water, and but the groundwater table is diminishing. There's subsidence, there's saltwater intrusion, all these things that drive towards, common sense tells us they should be doing rainwater harvest, but the interests of the water utility are not aligned with the environmental interests there, or the because the water utility use themselves largely as a commodity supplier, and they want to keep generating income to do that. So we, you know, how do you break through to what's to the sort of the other side? And I'm looking over here at Dick in my in the corner of my screen, and thinking of the effort that he has helped found and has been a leader in the Renew It, reimagining our nation's urban water infrastructure. What we're really kind of talking about is eventually, how do we change this entire grid? I mean, here we are putting perfectly good water down the system because the sewage has gotten too concentrated. Should we be turning that on its head and thinking about how we should be handling that sewage differently, rather than trying to keep fixing a system that we're kind of moving? We need to change paradigm to have a whole different way of looking at it. And I guess what I'm saying overall is that right now we are very dependent on a system, an urban municipal water system that requires a lot of water. It requires us to use a lot of water to move the drinking water, the potable water in, and the wastewater out. To really break that cycle so that we don't need as much water, whether it be through rainwater harvest or otherwise, means really reimagining that whole water infrastructure. It's not just about rainwater harvest. It's about so many other things, which requires all of our utilities to kind of come together and think together. And I realize that's kind of I mean, that's a big thing, but that's what Dick has laid on the table 10 years ago for us all to be thinking about and working on. And so I'm not sure how. I think that rainwater harvest is a piece of that. And once we start working on all those pieces, some of the drivers for rainwater harvest, even in areas with abundant surface water or groundwater sources, it will start to make more sense.
Mark, good to see you on mute. A lot there. And I'm happy to go to Charlene next, and then Amanda.
Yeah,
Thanks,
well,
Mark.
probably good to follow Lynn, being from a water-rich region. So I appreciate that while rain is falling, we still have some significant groundwater and water resource impacts. But one thing that strikes me as I listen to all of the panelists is this topic of scale, you know, from Lynn's rain barrel to these community-wide systems. And I think we need to think about that as these systems get bigger and bigger. They become more complex, they're more costly and more regulated. And so whether it's the individual homeowner or a county-wide system, you know, that scale is important. And I think that scale is one of the reasons we don't have all that cost data, because we have these very small systems and very large systems, and it's apples and oranges, and they're not compatible, and it's really hard to get consistent data. Another challenge, you know, we're seeing is we have, I know, well over 500 bioretention systems within our watershed. I think it's closer to 1,000. We've been doing them for almost 2 decades. We know where to site them. We know how to design them, build them. There's vendors and contractors that can maintain them. We have good cost data, good performance data, so we can really dial those systems in. We have about 10 reuse systems in our watershed, and they're all different, very different. So it's hard at this very early demonstration stage to start really getting the metrics to guide us through these discussions. But I do think that one thing the 2018 study in Minnesota noted that the #1 source of water was stormwater. The #1 use could be irrigation. And so that's, for us in Minnesota, that's a sweet spot. We have to make sure that works. We have to make sure we're protecting public health, that the regulations are practical, and really, I really think about who's going to operate this system. If a homeowners association is going to put in a small reuse system to meet a regulatory requirement, is that system going to be so complex and expensive that they're not going to be able to operate it? And that's kind of where we're seeing the future here is how do we achieve that so a homeowners association or a small business can have a system that they're capable of operating. And I think as professionals, we need to think about that and balancing health, regulation, and the environment.
Thanks, Mark. Charlene, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of continue on the thread that Lynn originally raised, and that I think Dave is encouraging us in the chat box to maybe pull out, which is, right now we've been talking about decentralized and centralized stormwater almost as though they're in parallel and maybe are not related to each other. And I think that's just because the topic is so broad, it's hard to talk comprehensively or in an integrated way. But really, this is something that we're wrestling with here in Austin as well. And that presents real challenges to utilities, whether you're talking about stormwater or you're talking about capture of any type of water for on-site use, and what that decentralized opportunity set, which often is so much more cost effective than what you can achieve at scale, not always, but often is, what that means for the operation of their system in a centralized way over time. So how might there be a change in what they see in flows in their sewage system or whatnot? But it is something that I continually come back to in our work, and just want to make sure that we all appreciate and describe when we talk to other people about this. Is it's not an either or. There are reasons, there are many reasons, from economic to regulatory to what have you, why we should be looking at how we build out decentralized and then better understand how it couples to the centralized solution set. And it's not only about the size of the infrastructure, but I would really encourage all of you in looking at, especially this question of economics. If you're trying to figure out, like, how do you make this pencil? What's the ROI? I heard Mark talk about this earlier. Of course, that's going to be something that the final calculus is based on your climate, your pricing for water, all those different factors. But for us here in Austin and lots of places in Texas overall, stormwater/rainwater alone is not going to be a great supply resource. It's because it's going to be flashy. It's not going to be there when you most need it. It is part of your portfolio, even at a decentralized scale. But for us to really make rainwater/stormwater work from a supply augmentation standpoint, we have to couple it to air conditioning condensate. And air conditioning condensate is a growing water resource that is in no way, other than humidity, affected by what's going on with rainfall patterns in any particular year, whether you're in a drought. But we know it's a load of water, it's a supply wedge that will grow because our population is going to grow. Unfortunately, with climate change, air conditioning days are going to grow. And so I'd really encourage you, depending on where you are in the country, to look at, could it be coupled in a way that makes the stormwater economics work? Because especially if you're combining rainwater with air conditioning condensate, really kind of similar from a contaminant pathogen load standpoint, treatment standpoint, but a huge bang for your buck in terms of overall yield and economics.
So if I can maybe continue on or sort of respond to some of the things that Charlene, you just mentioned. So I agree that I don't think that we need to look at this as an either or of distributed versus centralized existing, large scale systems. And I would caution against viewing water providers as they just want to keep their business model going. We all, from a municipality and or special district perspective, we have a lot of money invested in existing infrastructure that you can't just say, oh, that's a sunk cost, we're now gonna move to this. But I think what we need to look more creatively at is connecting those systems, which I think Orange County actually provides a really, really good example of. In North County, Orange County Sanitation District and Orange County Water District are co-located. And so water from the sanitation district goes through all of our, the sanitary treatment train, then goes to our groundwater replenishment system, which is reverse RO, micro infiltration, and then it's sent up to spreading grounds to go into our groundwater aquifer. And there is more and more movement towards, that's indirect potable reuse, but we're moving more and more towards potable reuse. That definitely has to happen. And so that's when you need to look at connecting these systems in the way that you can. And while I totally agree that I think decentralized systems and home-based systems can help, I don't mean to totally rain on everyone's parade, and pardon the pun, but you know what? I can't rely on my residents to run their irrigation system properly. And so relying on them to manage and maintain a, stormwater capture on a distributed system in perpetuity is not realistic. So it's great when you have people who are super motivated and they put in a system on their property, and then they sell that to the next homeowner who may or may not be as motivated, or the business turns over or whatever. We find, I'm very skeptical of distributed systems because of the ongoing O&M need and no way to ensure that operations and maintenance is being done consistently over time. Whereas when you have centralized systems through, a funded government or special district, even though we don't have dedicated funding for this, obviously, you at least know that, that O&M is ongoing. So I think that they can work together, but I kind of always think the bigger piece of the pie is going to be a centralized system.
Molly, can I jump in there because Amanda's points are spot on. The monitoring, the maintenance piece of downscaled is a big challenge. It's one that I personally feel on the stormwater side often is being overlooked. Here in my own community, we kind of write it off like, yeah, it'll just happen, but we know that's not the case, right? It's why on the drinking water side, I'm really glad to see Austin Water moving forward in a regulatory package that gives them the ability to have greater oversight over the management of on-site water for reuse, whether it's outdoor irrigation or indoor, and that's for stormwater, but all the other types of water we just talked about. So that's really essential if you're going to try to do any of this at all. It doesn't resolve the issue of the continued reinvestment. And it's part of the reason why it's great for people who are interested in this topic. Look at what San Francisco did with their pricing as it relates to that non-potable reuse ordinance, where if you develop a system like this, that we know from around the country, lots of systems like this, even in big campus style kind of buildings, can get mothballed because people don't know how to manage them. It's too complicated, whatever. And so they developed a pricing model that basically puts a significant incentive there for the building owner to continue operating that system. So your water rate goes up by 3 times if you stop using it and you start relying on potable beyond your water budget. But there's a lot of pieces in this. It's not just like, okay, yeah, allow people to do this and suddenly the problem solves itself. By no means is that the case at all.
Dick, you're unmuted. Do you want to join in on that?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the same themes that I agree there's a range of scales, but speaking from what I would call the California perspective, where we want to capture enough water to make a difference, somehow in my mind, I'm thinking of 10 acre feet a year. It's got to be sort of bigger than that or about that size. Dry wells along Laurel Canyon Boulevard are on the order of 10 to 15 acre feet a year. I mentioned the Stanford campus systems, east and west, about 30 acre feet a year. These are things that are big enough that they can be watched and managed and taken care of. And I would just say out here in the West, and then in some places where they've put in these bioswales, and you have these nice pictures when the things are first put in. Go look at the place, 4 or 5 years later, and I don't want to point fingers at anybody, but they don't look so hot, frankly. And like, who's taking care of them? And Amanda, I don't know if it's because the property owners got bored or maybe it was sold. The next person doesn't care. In terms of economics, remember, it's a false comparison to say, what am I paying today for water? Because there's no more of that water to go get. You have to say, what are the alternatives? And, and in sort of hierarchy, it's conservation, it's reuse, it's stormwater, it's desal. And it's going to be some combinations of those, I think, out here in the West.
So I'm going to sort of reframe slightly here because it does seem that there's a range of perspectives that could be related to different contexts, so different geographies and or different circumstances. It also strikes me that there may be some inconsistencies associated with inadequate research and data that helps us to better understand both opportunities and challenges. And it also seems that what I'm hearing between the lines is that to some extent, these have secondary benefits. So the primary benefit of being a water source is certainly one that we are focusing on in particular today. But there are a lot of other benefits associated with some of these more distributed systems that also could play into that evaluation of an ROI. So I'm wondering if anyone, since this has been raised in the chat, if anyone wants to make any observations about a lack of data and research, or a need for data and research, or any other observations about whether that's a real challenge or one that somehow maybe is a misperception, or any other observations. Dick.
Well, you said research, so that's the university. I have to chime in. There are a couple of things. One, Mark, I'm not sure we really know how well these existing BMPs work in terms of water quality improvement. Many of them are built to a specification, but there's not that other part of saying, all right, did they really remove the pollutant of interest? So there's work to be done on really quantifying how well the different systems work, and then think about ways to improve them in terms of treatment. And another one is, we've heard lots of different strategies to say they're all good, but at some point you need to step back and say, how are they all going to work together? If I push all my stormwater to the water treatment plant, is that, that's my summertime flow, my urban drool, as they call it, take care of that. What do I put in place for the rest of the year? How do these things build out, and what's the net benefit to our water supply? And in my case, I said something about the Bay Area. Well, it was the back of the envelope calculation that we could get 10%. It's really not even the back of the envelope. It's the back of a postage stamp, I would like to do better than that.
Molly, you're
think-
muted.
I
And I think it's getting
conveniently
experience.
unmuted.
Yeah.
Getting experience.
Yeah. So Molly, one of the things I think I want to acknowledge, of course, water utilities, and I represent wastewater utilities. So I certainly recognize that water utilities are important and they have important investments to maintain. But I think that the point I really want to make is that I was trying to make earlier is that there is a push-pull. We have to acknowledge that there's a push-pull between the interests of the utilities often and the interests of the individual. And sort of like the electric power sector has gone through some growing pains to figure out how distributed solar in particular can fit within the overall utility model. We've got that same struggle that we need to work through, and it's going to play out differently in different places, of how distributed infrastructure fits within the water utility model, and whether the water utility has some business opportunities there. I think probably San Francisco might be at the front of the pack on trying to figure some of that out. But how do we make it so it works for everyone? And in terms of being able to kind of have faith in the individual building owner to be able to maintain their own personal infrastructure, I totally recognize that it doesn't always work as well as we might imagine it to, but there are huge swaths of the country that currently have their own distributed infrastructure, those on wells and those on septic, and that's a lot of the country. And so we've managed to work, allow that responsibility to all those people. And so I don't think that as we kind of switch to thinking about distributed within an urban context, we've got to figure that out. But the point is, people have been managing this on their own, and to learn with very little regulation when it comes to wells, private wells. So the world is not going to come to an end with this, I don't think. I think we've got to make it easy. We've got to make it turnkey. We've got to have systems that are replicable so that people know how to maintain them. And we'll get this figured out, but it's going to be a journey.
Thanks, Lynn. And with that, I'm going to unfortunately have to wrap up. This has been a great exchange, and there's a lot more to dig into here. Obviously, this is a very dynamic and changing landscape, and exciting to be part of this conversation, advancing stormwater capture and use. I'm going to turn next to Seth Brown to wrap up for us. And thanks to everyone on the panels. Thanks for the help in preparing for this, and a lot of really good fodder for some continued conversations as we go forward. Seth.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. And, for a stormwater geek, which is what I consider myself, this has been absolutely fun to hear. It's just amazing to hear all these perspectives, and I appreciate all the panelists and the work that EPA and the Water Use Association put into this. So I just want to recognize that, first of all. And I'll mention that I'm coming from the perspective, I was born and raised in Minnesota, Water Ridge. I live in Fairfax County, so I'm one of Randy Bartlett's customers. So I come at this from more of the Water Rich perspective. And I'll say that, having this water, it's kind of dry versus wet kind of perspective was really a great, I think, way to contrast and illustrate, because what the different contexts of this are, because I think we often think, oh, this is just an arid climate thing. No. We've learned, and you could actually look at Dave, you went over the, what came in from the registrants. There's a lot of folks here, 40% that are from, non-dry areas, I'll say. So this is clearly, this is a broader thing than I think a lot of folks might think. So I think that's a big takeaway that I had. I'll just say, again, we've heard from panel, interest is high. You can look at the, again, the registrant information. Interest is high. It's rising. It's a rising topic. We've heard this consistently as well. We also heard, and that's also just because it's being seen as a resource more so than it has in the past. And of course, how that's valued, ties into the question about economics. And we heard from Charlene about PACE as a way to address on-site costs as a barrier, but also the fact that, wastewater had a lot of money back in the 70s. Stormwater has not seen that yet, but I know, we all see this, that there's more focus and more interest in getting more money into stormwater from the federal government. And I think we're going to see that. The thing that we need to consider, though, is what do we do when we get that money? So we need to be prepared. And I think that's a big part of this discussion. We're understanding what is it that we do. It's not just an arid climate type of thing. We also heard that the solutions vary. That's something I really appreciate from this discussion. Even within the same climate, the solutions and the context and the circumstances, and the scale, as Mark Dunne brought up, all these things drive different types of solutions. So, even the uses, again, I'll point to Mark, that irrigation is a use that we don't often think about, I hadn't thought about until and I've heard this from my membership as well, more and more, that irrigation is something that as a use that's a big driver in some areas, but there are some policy challenges there that we need to address. So regulations play a varying role. Some places, Charlene, you talked about Texas, it's not so much. in California. It's a big solution. It's a big part of a solution. And especially when we think about integrating water, wastewater and stormwater together, which is something we should always be trying to do. And it sounds like we've had some great solutions there. We heard about technology being, we heard about the Opti systems and other systems that are out there. That's a great, that's part of this solution as well. And we heard about upstream and downstream and urban versus rural or ag context. And I think there's more to be done there. So I think the big takeaway is, and I know I'm wrapping up right now, is that there's a lot to go here, Dave. I think we heard a lot here. So there's a lot of material here, and we're going to take all this material and it's going to be compiled and used to inform as we move forward with this wrap specifically. I want folks to know that this is being recorded, has been recorded, is going to be sent out. A link is going to be sent out in a couple hours. And again, all the reporting based upon this is going to be compiled in the near future at some point, but it's going to be coming out and it's going to inform this wrap, like I said, as we move forward. In September or so, there's going to be convening in at the Wingspread Center in the Johnson Foundation in Wisconsin. Hopefully, depending how things are going, that's going to happen in September. This is really going to help set the table for that. So I really appreciate everyone's discussion here. Did want to mention that we have another webinar that's scheduled. The National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, the organization I represent, we're going to be hosting that. That's on February the 23rd. And that's going to be on, as I think Dave talked about, stormwater capture treatment standards. And we had a little talk about that so far in this event, and we're going to be digging more into that. There's going to be future webinars, so keep an eye out there. We're going to try to get this out to the world as well. And lastly, I wanted to mention that we're going to have a featured session on stormwater capture, this topic, at the upcoming Water Reuse Association National Symposium in March. So I think we covered everything here, and I appreciate all the great conversations from all the different perspectives. It's been really great. Again, I want to thank EPA. I want to thank Molly, did a great job facilitating. Great job on that, and thank Water Reuse Association for doing all the work. So I think we're wrapping up now. Thanks a lot for everybody's participation and everybody for spending time with us today.
Thank you.